So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to what I would call like another fascinating conversation, because this is just what I like to do. I recently read Dr. Dan Keown's book, Spark and the Machine, and also his other really beautiful book, hard copy, called The Uncharted Body. And I loved his work so much and his mind that I reached out to him and asked him to come and chat with us. So welcome, Dan. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Meredith. And yeah, lovely to be on. So yeah, how can I help you understand Chinese medicine a bit better?
Well, what I found really interesting about your work, and just to let people know too, we've just connected, but we haven't actually had a conversation yet. So this is like the really first brush of actually sharing information. And of course, I was trained in acupuncture back in the 90s. And I've gone on to develop my own work in it. So I have a kind of weaving of East and West, and Dan does as well. Obviously, he's a medical doctor and an acupuncturist, which gives him a really beautiful fusion of understanding between East and West. And the research that I've done, or what I've kind of worked with in the body, there's a couple of main things that I feel I'm, because we're always still learning, that I'm feeling I'm going into, and I keep seeing in the body these embryological connections. And I don't know a lot about embryology, and this is why I liked his book so much, because Dan talks about acupuncture and understanding the meridians from an embryological point of view. So I wanted to be able to ask you some questions about that whole basis. So maybe you could just start with explaining, because I know that your extensive study, just give us a bit of a history of your work and what you've been doing and who you studied with, who I know was in China, to give you a real understanding of this embryological basis, which I think hasn't actually been done to the degree that you've done it, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the only chap who actually the chap who started the ball rolling in terms of understanding acupuncture's effect as occurring at an embryological level, or certainly using the same control systems that the embryo does, is a guy called Charles Shang, who was from Harvard Medical School. And he wrote a paper called The Growth Control Theory of Acupuncture. And this was done over 10 years ago now, probably about 15 years ago. And like a good scientific paper, it made predictions. It said that we will expect the following things to be found at acupuncture points, like an increased number of gap junctions and technical things that, to be honest, I don't fully understand. But this paper was effectively forgotten or lost or ignored by the medical establishment. And I came across it bizarrely when I was in China with a chap called Dr. Wang Juyi, who was a professor of acupuncture and had written a book along with Jason Robertson called Applied Channel Theory. And it was, he was just so clear about what was going on with acupuncture. He said, look, the channels are just spaces in the body, and chi flows in these channels, and that's all we're doing. We're just trying to feel the channels, feel the spaces in the body, because I went there to learn channel palpation from him. And then that evening, I was only in China for a couple of weeks, but that evening I stumbled across this paper by Charles Shang. And you put those two things together, the fact that, there's this very good theory of acupuncture that uses an embryological control system, and that qi is this electrical force that flows through spaces or channels in the body. And you have a very, very simple theory about how acupuncture works that also is completely at ease with Western scientific view of the body. In fact, I'm pretty clear now that what Chinese physiology does is actually elevate the Chinese understanding of the body above what we'd consider to be a Western scientific model. And it's not so much the Western scientific model is wrong, it's just that, for starters, it has no explanation of how the embryo self-organizes, which is the key aspect of our health. And that organization occurs through an electrical force, which is effectively qi. And Western science also has no appreciation for the electrical force that keeps our body governing the whole time. One example of that is the ECG. But it turns out all of our organs, all of our muscles, all of our, even our bones, all electrical. And this electrical force has energy, it has information attached to it. And as a result of that, it's living. And that living electrical force is chi, and how it flows through the body then guides how our body develops and how our body works. And the role of the acupuncturist is working out where that chi has got blocked or stuck and getting it to move correctly.
Yeah, I think that already gives people a good idea of why I love your work. So you're looking at the spaces in the body are the lines of fascia that are moving through as well.
Yeah, so this is why I always call them channels, because not meridians, because the natural thing to do when somebody says where's a channel in the body is to say, you know, well, there's loads of channels in the body. The body is just packed full of channels. You can see these acupuncture channels in any anatomy illustration you care to look at, because it's the space between structures. So if you look at any illustration of the arm, for instance, you'll see all these muscles underneath the skin, and you see the bone. And the artist, the skill in artistry is creating that negative space, the illusion that there is a division between structures. In reality, of course, everything is kind of a oneness. But definitely it's useful to have an understanding of a separateness with the body. And so that's what artists do with the negative space. Now, in Western medicine, we're preoccupied with the things in the body. So in my arm, there'd be a biceps muscle, a brachialis, triceps, etc. And that's what Western medicine effectively labels and is interested in. But between all those structures which are all lined with fascia, lies space. And that space is the acupuncture channels. So that's the fundamental difference between the Western anatomical model of the body and the Chinese description of the channel network, which specifically in this example is the Jing, is that the Chinese description is all about space between things, and the Western description is the things.
Right. And also you mentioned in your book about how when Western medicine goes in to do surgical kind of work, they're actually always using these spaces between the fascia in order to be, you can't go through the fascial plane, but you can follow all the fascial planes. And that's actually how Western medicine is getting into the body in order to do the things that it does, while the East are actually looking at those spaces that are everywhere in the body, packed full of channels, are what they're focusing on.
They almost have a kind of, surgeons almost have a pathological aversion to going crossing fascial planes. So for instance, if you look in the neck, you might occasionally see someone with a scar across here, which is a classic scar to get when someone's done a thyroid operation. Thyroid gland is just here. So the root of the lung, actually, the lung and the thyroid are in the same fascial space. But the place where surgeons now want to get into the thyroid is here, which is under the armpit. So it's a long way away from the thyroid. You would think that, you know, it's much easier. I mean, literally, there's just a tiny bit of tissue. There's probably about that much tissue between my neck and the thyroid. So you'd think, well, that's ridiculous easy. We'll go that way. But increasingly now, surgeons are going endoscopically or robotically under the armpit through that way. And the reason being is that once they're into that fascial plane, then they've got a direct access to the thyroid gland. So it means that they don't have to cross any fascial planes. And they just, the reason they hate crossing fascial planes is because it's when things start to go wrong. And although that's probably occurring at a bleeding and damage to structure level, I think also they're disrupting chi flow as well when they do this. And I think part of the reason things go wrong is because of the chi flow disruption they're doing when they're cutting across fascia. But the important thing to know, of course, is that this access here is the lung channel of Chinese medicine. So the lung channel starts in the lungs, goes up to the throat, thyroid, and then comes down into the armpit and goes round
Yeah, and then
the
it becomes external once it hits here and then goes down the arm. But a lot of
yeah,
people aren't necessarily familiar that within meridians, they start internally. They have an internal channel and an external channel. So it's beautiful that there
yeah,
are these connections to different parts of the body, even though a lot of times we learn just the external channels. These internal channels are really important because, as you said, the lung is very connected to the thyroid, and the meridian starts inside, in fact, in the large intestine, I believe, doesn't it? And then it goes up in through the lung and up to the thyroid, and then comes down into where it becomes external to lung 1 and 2, and then runs down the arm.
yeah. It's almost like the bodies should best be understood as these like 6 divisions or 6 planes or 6 like Russian dolls. I imagine it a bit like, it's not I imagine it. You can see these planes on CT scans, but they're quite complex. But they're almost like Russian dolls, 6 layers, and the most of the layers the Zhui Yin, which is liver, which is translated as liver and pericardium, but it's not really the liver and pericardium. The Zhui Yin channel includes the channel that goes into the arm and leg, but it also includes this huge space that moves up from the scrotum in the men and the uterine lining in women all the way up through the diaphragm. Includes the pleural channel, pleural cavity. It's really a channel. The pericardial channel, and also the pericardium, in fact, grows the arterial supply to the muscle of the heart. So it also includes that. That's also part of the Zhui Yin. So this is one of the problems with terminology, is that this is kind of, people think, oh, it's a pericardium channel. Actually, it's the upper end of this enormous channel called Zhui Yin, which it also includes the channels into the arms. It also includes the venous system. It's a complete reorganization of how we've organized the body. That's what happens. But at the end of it, it's a lot simpler.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I want to just clarify for people who aren't familiar with the meridians yet, that there's a couple of different ways of classifying them. And I want to pick your brain too about where you think the terminology of lung, large intestine, stomach, and spleen actually come from, because they're not, we get confused in the West and think that it's just direct organs. I just cut out there for a second. I hope that still came through. We get a little bit confused in the West that we're looking at direct organ relationship, and people say lung meridian, they think there must be something wrong with their lungs. But there's this other system called 6 divisions that is a way of understanding, as you were saying, planes through the body. And that's very much, I notice a lot how it will seem like when you're looking at what's going on in the arm and what's going on in the leg, that they're really describing the same plane, even just on the limb, let alone what's going on inside. So I just wondered if you could speak to, because they won't be familiar necessarily with Zhu Yin and Han Shao Yang, different kinds of things like that. How do you describe, first of all, the basic way that we look at the 12 meridians plus the 2 extraordinary ones with the lung, large intestine, stomach, spleen? Where do you think that way of classification came from? And how do you describe the different versions, so to speak, of looking at what the 6 divisions are, where we're really coupling those 12 meridians, instead of it going across this way, you're coupling them this way into 6 clear divisions, which give you a whole planal understanding of the body. But that's not really how we're taught in acupuncture. So how could you simplify all those concepts for people who really aren't particularly familiar with the meridian system yet?
Well, the other system is more complex. So like thinking, well, firstly, let's start with the Western system. Yeah. So the Western system is basically, let's keep looking smaller and smaller and subdividing things, and we'll basically, anything that's enclosed within its own little bit of fascia, effectively, we'll call an organ or a muscle or something like that. So you get this with the Western system. You've got a description of the body that is mainly based on like their positions relative to each other, not their functional position or not the way they grew. So and what happens is, like, literally sometimes they discover new parts of the body and they have to add this in, and then it slightly changes it. So recently they discovered something called the interstitium, which is basically the triple burner. and they had to kind of add this in afterwards. So it's this mosaic patchwork of different parts of the body. That's the Western description. Hang on, you are about to. Oh, sorry,
you
ignore that.
raised your hand by mistake.
So the Western description is just this patchwork quilt of lots of different things that are in the body, and how they related. Well, you know, they're close to each other generally. That's the description. Now, the analogy I use would be like if you looked at the animals of the world and started dividing them up in their mature form. In other words, the form they are now, not where they came from phylogenetically. Yeah. So you would look at the animals of the world now, and you might say, okay, all of the animals that walk on two legs must be related. So we'll put ostriches with chimpanzees with kangaroos. You know, they're all related, all walk on two legs. And then all the animals that fly must be related as well. So we'll put bats and birds and flying foxes. They're all same family. That's kind of what Western medicine has done. A more sensible approach, and the approach that's used, is to go phylogenetically. In other words, where did the animals come from? Yeah, where was their root origin? So with an ostrich, and you'd say, well, it's a bird. I mean, it doesn't fly, doesn't swim, but it's definitely a bird. So we'll put it in the bird family because we understand where it's come from. And so it's the same with our bodies. Like, what the description that Western medicine gives is this mature description of the body. It hasn't got the intellectual power, and I use that word carefully, to work out where everything's come from. And the reason being that in embryology, there's a certain point where it just starts to get so confusing as to what's going on, because you've got a living process going on at a microscopic level in another body generally, and so they just don't know what's really happening. If we actually look at like more primitive animals, we get another idea about what's going on. In fact, the origin of every animal on Earth is from the jellyfish. And if we look at the jellyfish, we see there's just 3 layers. And what happens is the inner and the outer layer of a jellyfish, which are endoderm and ectoderm, they actually persist in humans. So we also have an inner and an outer layer. And then the middle part of the jellyfish effectively divides into these 4 different layers. And those 4 layers then do things like the heart, which is really about nutrition and blood, the lymphatic system, the muscular wall of the intestinal system, and this returning that has to occur, which occurs through the liver. And so those then create these 6 layers, these 6 divisions in the body, which within each one, there is a kind of upper and a lower pole. And those upper and lower poles, like their energy condenses to create an organ. So for instance, in Shaoyin, which is just this one division, including the entire arterial system within the body, yeah, including in the brain. The upper pole of this isn't the brain, it's actually the heart, and the lower pole is the kidney, which really regulates the blood pressure. That's its main role, regulating blood pressure. And so that's what the organs are within this. They're just the condensations of energy and matter within one of these divisions. And so that's much simpler. So if you use, for instance, a point on arm Shaoyin or heart 8 or part 8 there. Yeah.
And I just want to clarify for people that that Shaoyin means the coupling of heart and kidney as a meridian system. So just between the crossover between the meridian words that we understand and the 6th division term being Shaoyin. Sorry, go ahead.
And yeah, so if you use the point on the heart channel, you will also be affecting the kidney channel, yeah, in the same way that if for instance, I'm in the bottom floor of my house at the moment, and there's it's like the room over there is like the kidney and this is the heart. Well, if there was a bad smell this is the kitchen, so if there was a bad smell, it would permeate through into that room as well fairly easily. So it's the same with the body. So this 6 divisions, just for me, like your biggest problem with understanding the body is complexity. I say this to students the whole time. They kind of, I explain something to them and they look at me as though it can't be that simple. And I'm like, well, you've got to keep it that simple, because the complexity will come, guaranteed, you know, and they're just starting to get it now, actually, after about a year and a half, about how the complexity is just this mind numbing problem, like, because like every single person is different and they come in and you've got to somehow create some kind of formula for making them better. And so you've got to keep everything really simple. So the 12 acupuncture channels is, you can make that 6 divisions and then just consider them an arm and a leg aspect. And then the extraordinary channels are really interesting, super interesting. But the Ren and the Do are fairly simple to understand. The Do is simply the connection from your back into your spinal channel and brain, and the Ren is just where the midline meets at the front. So
this yeah, no, that's really good. So there's a couple of things that I want to try to remember to ask about that, because it's really pivotal in relation to where I'm making connections into what I've been seeing in the body for 25 years and what I've been kind of putting together, which ends up being geometry, but it's really about planes of energy moving through, which is a very similar idea. So for instance, in 6 divisions, I mean, I wasn't taught in acupuncture school that if you look at lung and large intestine down the arm, or the stomach, spleen, and the leg, that they're actually the same kind of plane moving through. And so that's a correct statement, essentially, isn't it? That we're looking at.
Yeah.
I just want to double check that what I'm seeing, because I wasn't taught that, but I keep looking at it and it's like, but they're just the same plane moving through, and you can see.
But I mean, I imagine at acupuncture school you weren't taught that the channels were spaces within the fascia.
Not at all. No.
Or that chi was effectively an electrical force that organizes the body.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I start reading the stuff with so for instance, talking about Ren and Do, so for clarification for people who, there's the 12 classical meridians, and then there's 8 extraordinary ones, and they kind of pluck 2 from the 8 and classify them often with the 12. And so they're called Ren and Do, and Ren runs down the front, Do runs up the back, to make it simple. And Dan was just explaining the aspect of where you're actually going into the body more, as opposed to just thinking about it as lines on the body, which is how we're really taught. We're very linear people. So we're really thinking about lines on the body more, instead of planes running through the body, which is what the body's been teaching me over the years. So using Ren and Do as an example, I see it as one plane running right through the body. I see in many ways, when you're looking at even lung and large intestine, there's a plane that runs through, almost as if you could take 3 slices or 2 slices through the arm, and you would have planes running through, and you would have the pericardium with the triple heater on the other side, and you would have the small intestine with heart on the other side, and you could like literally just do a strip. There's theory as to why the JAGs happen, which I cover in my Meridian program, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that too. So many things I'd like to talk to you about, but just looking generally at the lines running through, I'm seeing planes moving through, and those planes can be looked either horizontally, vertically, in between, diagonally, different kinds of ways that give us access to the core body. So my first question would be, is it rational from your point of view, or reasonable to consider that Ren and Do are just one plane moving through the body? If you could consider electrical or perhaps even biophoton charge, however this world works, and the body in that way.
I think so. One of the earliest kind of things I ever saw about acupuncture theory and embryology was this idea that when you get that ball of cells early on, which is like 8 or 16 cells, that at that point you've already got the beginning of the Ren and the Do and the Yang Chao Mai and all of the other channels. You know, it was kind of, oh, here's the Dai Mai, here's the Do. Actually, it's way more complex than that. In that, what happens, that ball of cells, effectively, almost nothing from that survives your into your body in one way. I mean, they're doubling the whole time, but the ball of cells gets to a certain point and hollows out.
Yeah.
And actually, within that hollow, within the ball of cells, which fills with fluid, you get a tiny membrane sitting across this hollow that then folds in on itself all the time within this ball of cells, which is now at this point has become the amniotic sac and the placenta, the ball of cells, and that across that membrane, then the baby then effectively grows. And so with the embryology, I think it does nicely explain everything about what's going on in the body, but it's important to also understand what the embryology actually teaches us about the body. And the Do channel and the Ren channel are really, in my opinion, are so opposite each other that they're not, that they're like operating like two different magnets in a way. They're connected, but they're not. There's not. I don't think there's a plane of energy between them in that sense. In fact, I think it goes more around like the microcosmic orbit. I don't know if you've heard of the microcosmic
Yeah, no, very
orbit.
much so. And this is where I kind of feel that again, where I don't think there's any one right or wrong answer in what I'm about to say either. But again, just different perspectives. So I think that I agree with the microcosmic orbit idea. And again, it's kind of like a circling around the body. And yet if it can even circle around the body, there's a connection between the two. And you could call it a plane moving through, even if it doesn't embryologically hold up. Yet there is another, an acupuncturist, and I forget his name at the moment, but he's really mapped out, he has a small book that has mapped out the idea that you're talking about when cells start to differentiate, when they're, you go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and that's where the channels begin on a more simplistic level. He's actually mapped that out in relation to the vector equilibrium as well, which is Buckminster Fuller's concept of where all balance is, or the 0 point field. And so so it's just interesting to look at all the different ways. I distinctly see that one of the ways to get into the center of tension and where we lock from breath, from thought to breath to fascia to hold in the body, that then affects what we would consider deep, but is more exterior to the body, that there are planes of energy that allow us better access into that. And that's what all of my work is about, is kind of discussing and teaching that because I've been in practice for almost 30 years working on bodies. And with that understanding of being able to touch a body and think inside, and there are specific centers inside that I want to see if there's any correlation to the organizational centers that you're talking about. So I guess I'm just riffing on the idea that that I see planes and I'm not sure where they fit. I just know they work well when the mind is thinking that way, either working with one's own body or on somebody else's.
I mean, there's a plane of, there'll be a, I got very interested in like squid machines, which are superconducting quantum interference devices for measuring tiny magnetic fields. Like they're so tiny, these magnetic fields, that they have to put you into a magnetically sealed box for this machine to be able to pick up the magnetic fields in your body, because otherwise the Earth's magnetic field would just be like the equivalent of a hurricane blowing through at the same time. So it wasn't a lot of research. The strong magnetic field there. So
start from the beginning. Sorry, start from the beginning. You cut out. So we talked about there being like kind of like a Faraday cage sort of idea of being able to test the magnetic fields that are very fine. Go on from there.
So if you could actually look at the body very, very carefully with I mean, I'd love one day for there to be a machine like this that could actually measure the magnetic fluctuations in the body and the electromagnetic fluctuations effectively, because that's what chi is. But if you could, I'm sure you would see, down the midline at the front, just a kind of a chasm or a line or a wall, or some kind of force that was going straight down the midline.
Force. It would be more like a line.
And it would be the same on the back as well. You'd see. So in that sense, there's a plane of, there's definitely a plane of energy. But as soon as you get, this is one of the key things to understand, is that as soon as you get into the body, then all the rules that apparently are on the outside change, because suddenly you've got to deal with the internal anatomy of the body. And in the same way, the analogy I use all the time is your house, because it's a nice, easy analogy that everyone can understand. you look on the outside of the house and you'd probably have very, you'd understand there were layers, you know, there's first floor, second floor, third floor, but you probably wouldn't understand the internal arrangement of the rooms by looking from the outside. And certainly if you then just went in there blind and tried to navigate your way around, you wouldn't get very far. So that's what the inside of the body is. You're not going to understand it by looking at the outside. You're going to have a look at the inside and then work out how all of these roots are. And so that's why you've got to study it. That's once you study it, you realize there's a good reason why large intestine 4, you know, affects the nose. It doesn't really so much affect the large intestine as the nose. And why it's called large intestine channel, I don't know. But probably its relation to lung. But that's the kind of key understanding that people have to appreciate when they start looking at the surface anatomy of the channels and where the channels are. It's like they will connect to the organs they're talking about once you understand the internal roots. And it's just the same as in your house. You could have like, okay, well, this is the house next door, but the house next door is a foot away from me. You know, their kitchen is a foot away from me, but there's no way I'm getting in there from my house. And it's the same in the body. You get these things that are very close together, like the thyroid and the thyroid gland, yeah? The thyroid gland and this skin here, but those two are not connecting to each other. Whereas underneath here, they connect. And so that's what the acupuncture channels are really showing.
Right. So when you're talking about organizational centers in the body, now I recognize that, you know, you're saying that in embryological formation, there are basically kind of hubs that help organize what's going on in and around the body. Do you want to expand on that before I ask my question, so that people are
so
a little bit more?
this goes down this. So the key, there was a guy called Terence McKenna who said that like science operates on the basis of like, give me one question and I'll explain the rest. And I think his one question was like, that science asks a gimme to is like, why are we here? Or something like, how did the universe arise? It's a big question. It's the big question. Yeah, the big question. Science goes, well, I can't answer that, but I'll answer the rest. It's like, well, you can't answer the big one. So that's what we're really interested in. You know, and that's why you end up in the kind of mess we're in now, where it's like, trust the science nonsense. But the same in Western medicine and Western science. It's like there's one big question, yeah, that needs to be answered before we can really move on. And that big question is, how does the embryo self-organize? How do we start from a single cell, and that single cell divides until it creates a self-replicating human that's, you know, able to talk and speak and do everything, and, you know, go out into the land and create civilization. You know, that's how amazing that single cell is. So how does it do that? What does it do? The kind of facile and easy answer is to just say, oh, genetics, but that isn't an answer at all. And the thing is, embryology knows that as well. And in fact, embryology also knows that this is the key question. This is the most important question. And as far as I know, it's already given 2 Nobel Prizes for 2 scientists who got close to answering that question. I would imagine there's other Nobel Prizes in medicine I don't know about that have got close to answering that question, because it is the key question in the whole of medicine. How does the embryo organize itself? How does it self-organize itself? And what Western science has done is explain the system it uses to organize itself. And this system involves nodes, which are, it's called organizing centers. And these organizing centers are parts of the embryo, parts of the developing person that tell the tissues around it how to behave, what to turn into, whether to turn into muscles or bone or liver or heart. And then these organizing centers communicate with other organizing centers through channels or spaces. At first, they said they spread chemicals called morphogens, but increasingly it's clear that actually it's electricity that's being shared between these organizing centers. And there's a the old-fashioned idea of a morphogenetic field, which was a idea that existed about 100-150 years ago, and then for whatever reason fell out of fashion. I don't know why, because it was 100% on target.
And
There
Rupert
is a
Sheldrake has
morphogenetic
brought
field.
that to light over the in our more contemporary times. He's written a whole book, Rupert Sheldrake, about that.
Yeah. He's amazing, Rupert Sheldrake. Yeah, he's a proper scientist.
Yeah.
He'd never say trust the science. That would be no proper scientist would ever say trust the science. Would say, like, no, you have to interrogate the science. You have to be skeptical of the science. That's what a scientist is. He's like, he's a true skeptic. He's like, I doubt my ability to be any knowledge to be accurate.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the skeptics, I think, were so skeptical they even doubted the ability of words to convey truth. So I think they practically killed themselves off by refusing to accept anything as true.
Right, the skeptics on the whole philosophical thread of skeptics back in the day.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, proper skeptics. Skeptics, not people who just say, "Oh, where's your evidence that acupuncture works? Where's your evidence that surgery works?" That's what I always say to doctors. I'm like, flipping hell. Like, I tell you what, if we're going to talk about evidence, let's start with like that extremely dangerous, extremely expensive, extremely traumatic stuff you do called surgery. Let's see some evidence that works. And there's practically none. And when they do studies into surgery versus placebo surgery, it's possible sometimes to do placebo surgery in non-emergency cases. They find a lot of the time, they find placebos as efficacious as the real surgery.
So would you not say, though, that a surgery to, there's a lot of life-saving surgeries that I'm sure a lot of people would say, what do you mean that surgeries don't work?
Yes, I make a big differentiation in medicine, Western medicine, between emergency medicine, which I consider to be good and work and extremely useful. And I am an emergency doctor. I was for 20 years. And the rest of medicine, which I was almost always got very poor evidence, if any evidence, has got huge harm associated with it a lot of the time. I mean, just look at what's going, even before this vaccine, so-called vaccine rollout, inoculation rollout, even before that, my argument was always like, look, vaccines may work or they might not work. Yeah, this is old-fashioned vaccines. Yeah, but there's no evidence, there's very little good evidence to show they do work. Yeah, so my point was, look, I'm not gonna. I actually stopped vaccinating my kids because I couldn't convince myself they worked. So I was just like, I can't. My first kid's vaccinated, was always ill. Kids 2 and 3 aren't vaccinated, very healthy. But the reason I stopped was because I couldn't convince myself with the evidence that they worked. But with emergency care, we kind of work on the basis that we haven't got time. We haven't got the luxury of doing evidence. And I don't want to enroll in any trial where basically they're looking at whether or not a trauma surgeon fixing my leg is a good thing or a bad thing when it's basically, broken in 4 parts. So look, I'm fine with like there not being any good evidence in emergency medicine, that kind of emergency medicine, although let's do as much evidence, let's do as many studies as we can within those constraints. But when you look at non-emergency medicine, there's almost no evidence to show it works and often huge evidence of harm. One of my favorite stats is the fact that when doctors go on strike, almost always mortality drops. And when doctors go on strike, they keep emergency care running, because they say, quite rightly, it'd be unethical not to give emergency care. So in other words, if you're hit by a bus, we'll still treat you. If you've got sepsis, we'll still treat you. If you're having a baby, which is like an emergency, I count that as emergency care as well, we'll still treat you. But if you want to have your diabetes followed up and checked, we're not going to treat you. That's non-emergency care. So when doctors go on strike, they stop all of that non-emergency care, but keep the emergency care going on. And they've done multiple studies over 5 different countries. And apart from 2 times where there was no change in mortality, the other times mortality always dropped.
That's
and not any
fascinating.
fat.
So what
Yeah.
would you consider being a surgical intervention that you would classify as not outside of emergency care that you would consider not working or being questionable as to whether it worked or not?
Well, even like, so when I spoke to this was about a little, I was speaking to an ENT doctor actually, and we were talking about a little study on hydroxychloroquine involving 50 patients that showed very clearly hydroxychloroquine worked, and he said that study's too small, and I said no, it's not. Its p-value was fine, which is the probability it was chance, because hydroxychloroquine's so good that basically it's such a strong effect you don't need a big study. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, where's your evidence that your surgery works? You know, I'll make it easy for you. Give me your most common routine elective operation you do, yeah, as an ENT surgeon, you know, thyroidectomy or something like that. Show me the evidence, you know, show me a double-blind randomized control trial to show that works. Yeah, nothing.
Well,
And I said, I'll tell
thyroidectomy,
you what, the whole, even in the whole of surgery, yeah, I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you this, yeah, the whole of surgery, give me your most common operation in the whole of surgery. I would guess it's something like a cholecystectomy where you take the gallbladder out, yeah. And I said, what about that? Can you show me a trial showing that works? And still crickets, nothing. And in fact, what I did is I looked up, and there's no studies out there comparing cholecystectomy versus no treatment, but there is acute or like urgent cholecystectomy versus delayed cholecystectomy. Yeah. So when you get an inflamed gallbladder, the advice is always, if there's gallstones there, the advice is always to take it out at some point. The question was, well, should we take it out immediately or should we wait 6 weeks to take it out? And the results. Now, the question is, if you wait 6 months, do you get better results? And then after that, it's
one
like,
second, you froze there. So you froze at the point where you said, should we wait now or should we take it out in 6 weeks? And then you cut out after that.
So when they actually looked at the results of the study, they found that the group that they waited 6 weeks to take it out actually did better than the group that they took out immediately, or you know, as soon as the patient was settled. So then the question becomes, well, is 6 weeks long enough? Maybe if you leave it 6 months, you get better results still. And maybe if you leave it 6 years. And then the question is, maybe if you never take it out, you get better results.
Unless it becomes an emergency, as you were saying, crosses over into an emergency situation where it can be fatal, in fact, if the gallbladder bursts.
Well, yeah, that's it, exactly. I mean, then it's a different thing. But you know, it's like well, you can treat that in a different way, and you could basically just factor that into the yeah, okay. So if you don't have your gallbladder operation, there's a 1 in 100 chance you might end up as an emergency, and you might have to have this done to you, and there's a 1 in 300 chance that will kill you. If you do have your gallbladder operation, you know, etc., etc., there's a 1 in 100 chance that operation, it's probably more like, I would guess 1 in 30 chance that the operation will go badly in some way, you know, and you'll have like chronic problems, you know, and there's a 1 in 200 chance that it's going to kill you. So it's that's the thing. That's why you should do studies. You know, is it better to have that operation or not? And they don't know. The whole of surgery is basically just everyone's just, it's like Tom Cruise in Top Gun. Tom Cruise in Top Gun. It's like they're just basically on a wing and a prayer.
Right.
Like, you know, I'm not suggesting surgeons are mavericks, but they're not a million miles away from it. They're basically just, they don't really know really whether what they're doing is the right thing. They're just doing it because that's what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And the point is, it's fine. I'm not, you know, here to knock surgeons or to take them out or anything, but the idea that like that what we do with acupuncture, which is unbelievably safe. I mean, it's just next level safe. There's nothing as safe as this in medicine at all, especially if it's somebody who knows what they're doing. The idea that should have like even the same level of evidence as surgery is absurd, let alone evidence that's way above what any surgery's got. It should be the other way around. Like this, the acupuncture effectively doesn't need any evidence to show it works. Surgery requires extraordinary evidence to show it works.
Can you clarify that? Why would acupuncture not need evidence that it works?
Because on the risk, it's risk benefit. So really how medicine works is a risk benefit ratio. Okay. So when you go, and that risk isn't necessarily even the risk to the patient, it could be the doctor's reputation, the risk. So when you go to see your doctor and you say, I've got a sore throat, and, you know, I need some antibiotics, the doctor's weighing up a number of things. One of them is like, if I don't give this patient antibiotics and she comes back in 3 days' time with sepsis, and is she then going to basically blame me for it and sue me? And you know, so a lot of the time doctors will just go, here's some antibiotics, off you go. Patient's happy, doctor's happy. Yeah, what he's really done is weighed up the risks and the benefits. Plus, if he's good, he's done something called the Centaur score, which assesses your chance, your risk of having a bacterial infection there. And then he's made an executive decision about whether to get antibiotics or not. But it's risk versus benefit. So all of medicine's always really running on, what's the risk I don't give her antibiotics, she gets sepsis and dies? What's the risk I do give her antibiotics? And, you know, and nothing realistically, even though there's things like Clostridium difficile and MRSA, realistically, the doctor's not going to get any knockback if he gives antibiotics, and the patient's unlikely to be unhappy as well. So that's how medicine really works. So within that equation, acupuncture has zero risk. It's just phenomenally safe. It's like a 1 in a million chance of seriously injuring you.
I liked when you were talking about in the book, when you were working in emergency, and that you gave a couple of examples of where you really helped somebody who was in quite a state of, you know, I won't say crisis, but a very acute state of problem, and that you would fix them, and that it kind of freaked the other people out in the hospital. And ultimately you had to stop using acupuncture, even though it was extremely effective, because there was nobody there to back you up if anything went wrong with that. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, because I found that to be a very interesting part of your story.
Yeah, I mean, it was phenomenal, like the acupuncture. I mean, like people that would have come into hospital going home, you know, that's how good it I used to use, so I used the needles, but then after that I used to use massage, which taught me a lot about how acupuncture works. But you know, I've probably saved, just in, you know, thousands and thousands of pounds on people that would have come into hospital who went home. Nosebleed, you know, the most spectacular one was a nosebleed. The guy was just like pouring blood out of his nose. This is a point anyone can find. It's basically, if you put your nose to your arm, where your nose hits your arm is where the point is, and that's lung 3, Tian Shu, I think, heavenly meeting, and basically you massage there, and it stops the nosebleed, and it works. And I used that a number of times, and the most dramatic time was in Jersey Hospital in the Channel Islands, and this junior doctor was with me, and he was desperate to put this horrible tampon effectively down a person's nose, and he was all ready, you know, he had his gels, had his gloves and everything. This was just hosing out the left side of his nose, and I just massaged it for about 30 seconds. It slows down, starts dripping, stops. Patient's just astonished, you know. The doctor's kind of, he's half astonished, half pissed off, because he wanted to do this procedure. And then 2 minutes later, like, it starts again, it starts hosing out again. You know, the doctor's like really happy about this, because he's like, great, I can throw this thing. I'm like, no, stop. Massage again, massage a little bit on the other side as well. It stopped again. And this time it didn't restart. So, you know, that guy would have come into hospital, because once you've got this horrible thing down your nose. And the number of times I've treated people that, you know, in A&E that would have come in, but eventually what happens, one of the consultants turned around to me and he went, like, Dan, you were in resus the other day, and one of the nurses was concerned about using acupuncture on this patient, and you know, and his point was, and it was a good point, he said, look, if something happened, yeah, and it doesn't even have to be something from the acupuncture itself, say that patient had died, yeah, and somebody at some point went, you killed him with the acupuncture, which is obviously absurd, but still possible in a strange way. I'm not an expert on acupuncture. I mean, I can tell anyone whether you've done the right thing or not. And like nobody around here is, you know, so
You're on your
so I
own.
realized that basically I'd be standing up there in court with a professor of medicine probably against me, who everyone would believe, obviously in court, who was paid by the drug companies indirectly to poo-poo anything like acupuncture, who just ripped me a new arsehole, frankly. And I wouldn't have a leg to stand on.
Right.
And so I just realized that whilst the system was so corrupt that it was hopeless to try and change it within, I would just get churned up and destroyed at some point,
Right.
you know, even though I'd had spectacular results.
Yeah, and it'll be so amazing when there are more doctors like yourself who understand both Western and Eastern to such a beautiful degree that you can make those kind of differences, and that will encourage the kind of research required in order to be able to allow the public to receive help of that nature, which will ultimately help Western medicine because it will reduce the amount of wait in doctors' care rooms and in hospitals and what have you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at what's happened with, you know, so this COVID. So the CDC basically effectively made, what did they do? I mean, if you look at all the financing around like COVID and in the US, and it's all, the hospitals are literally incentivized to kill people with COVID in their hospitals. They get a death payout if somebody dies in the hospitals with COVID, and the whole system is corrupted and broken. It's people. I don't think people really understand how deep the corruption is. It's completely rotten Western medicine. It effectively has to be, in my view, restarted. And I think that was going to happen, because I think once people realize what these doctors have done to them with these experimental RNA inoculations, mRNA inoculations, which cause cancer. I mean, RNA is well known. Injecting RNA is well known to cause cancer. There's even a name for it, oncorin, I think it is. An oncorin. It's a fragment of RNA that causes cancer.
Right.
Which, interestingly, is an anagram of Omicron. Yeah.
So I had no idea we were going to go here with that. And it's really interesting as a medical doctor and an acupuncturist to hear your point of view, for sure. I know a lot of people will turn off immediately as soon as they hear you saying anything against the vaccines. And I want to, really honor the fact that while you might not have created the vaccines yourself, while some people who are speaking and being called misinformation have, and so there's a big campaign to not share any information. A lot of people will immediately say, well, you weren't working directly with vaccines. You don't know. You just sound like a right-wing conspiracy theorist. So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to share one quick story, and then I want to ask you a pointed question that I think would be a question that some people of that mindset might ask. And first of all, what's interesting about vaccination is that the Chinese actually discovered it 1,000 years before the West did, right? So people were getting smallpox, and however they figured this out, they would take the vesicles from the smallpox off people and grind them up and snort it up their nose. And in that way, their body would be given, a dead version of the smallpox, and yet enough to inoculate them against it. And that's what they were doing 1,000 years before Jenner, or whatever his name was, ended up starting the idea around vaccination. So I think that's really interesting too.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people would say in relation to vaccine, the first thing that comes up, if you say vaccines don't work, they say, well, what about the polio vaccine? So I just wanted to be able to give you, that's the common response to something that you would say. I want to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, this whole thing of like basically like vaccines being like a single homogenous medicine group, if you like it's just absurd. I mean, I struggle to get my head around this idea that like, it's like describing cars. It's like, imagine if like you just thought all cars were the same, and you owned a crappy old Fiat that basically could do 0 to 60 in 25 seconds and break down, and somebody else owned a Lamborghini that could do 0 to 60 in 1.2 seconds, and you went, oh man, cars are just useless, they're just so slow and they're always breaking down, and oh man, are you anti-car? It's like, you know, it's absurd. It's like, why do vaccines have some kind of privileged, like, literally, I was joking for a while on Facebook that you could put dog feces into a syringe and call it some kind of vaccine, and people would just go, oh, it's got to be good for you then. You know, that's the first thing. So sorry, it wasn't anything within your question. It's something that I've noticed in the broader consciousness of people, that the idea that a vaccine is a vaccine is a vaccine. It's like, no, a vaccine is a type of medicine which effectively is a poison. That's how vaccines work. Yeah, you give a tiny amount of the poison. In the original case, like you said, the dead smallpox virus in Edward Jenner's place, it was variola vaccinia, which was cowpox, you know, which is a living poison. That's how I see viruses and bacteria, living poisons. You give a tiny amount of this poison to the immune system recognizes the poison and mounts a response to it. That means that when it encounters that poison, living poison again, then it is able to destroy it. Yeah, so that's the process of vaccination. But the vaccines themselves are all different medicines, and each of them has to be considered on their own merits. Polio, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it got rid of polio vaccine, got rid of polio. I mean, did it, didn't it? I don't know, but I'm sure it did. I don't have a problem with that. Doesn't mean that, like, when Pfizer released some experimental gene therapy, effectively, that then because polio has disappeared off the face of the earth, then yeah, wave it through. It's a vaccine, it must be safe. It's absurd.
So you question definitely the efficacy and the safety of it, and feel that there should be more research behind it, for sure. And even though you didn't I'm just thinking of things that people would say to you from, you know, who are very, very pro-vaccine, very upset and wishing death threats upon people who won't get vaccinated, because that's happening now.
Then get that one. Wishing death upon somebody who's not getting vaccinated and they think that person should get vaccinated to prevent them from dying. I mean, it's a cult. It's a religious cult that is, you know, is formed because people have lost their sense of God.
Right.
They've lost their connection to God. And that's another big turn off for people, isn't it? It's when you mention God. It's like, you know, it's interesting because almost everyone who has responded to this in the way that I have, which is basically like, this is effectively a very deep-seated evil within our society that's corrupted the top end of our society. Almost everyone who's just gone, no way, I'm not engaging with that, has a spiritual belief in God, I find.
Interesting.
And
God
everyone
being
else,
a very amorphous sort of term as well, I think is important also as well. I think there's deep spiritualism in that all spiritualisms and all dedications to spirit in its truth of all religions have the same seed. That would be my opinion of that.
I agree.
Yeah. That's good to know. And
also, I mean, I don't go to church or anything. It's, you know,
right. It's just honoring that there's a mystery much deeper than our human brains that simply can't figure out the depth of the mystery. And if we think that we can, and we think that we've got it sorted out, and we think that it's just all chaos that's come together, that perhaps we're not, we're missing the mystery. And
this is it, this physical reality. See, you can't detach this stuff from medicine. That's the thing. It's like when like a few years back, you know, I was working with a company in the US called Ghost Flower, and the guy, the kind of CEO guy, was like, Dan, can you just like stop talking about politics effectively and just talk about medicine? It's like, I'd love to, but you can't, because the two are just interwoven at the moment in a horrible way, and the last 2 years just shown that, hasn't it? Because in the last 2 years, effectively, politics and medicine have become the same thing.
Well, and also even hundreds and thousands of years ago, when Confucianism and Taoism and all these different kinds of Eastern religions were developing and exploring themselves, I remember reading that they were saying, it's philosophy, right? It's a philosophy of living, and which is the basis really of Chinese medicine, and to a beautiful degree. And whoever had the best medicine proved their own philosophy, and that would therefore gain the best followers. So right there, the idea of, you might have a nice philosophy about spirit, but if you can't heal me, then I don't know to trust you. But if you could heal me, then therefore I'll believe what your philosophy is. So already right there, the whole concept of medicine and philosophy, as we would categorize them, were completely interwoven. And now science has become the new church, really. In our
100%.
society.
Yeah, science and materialism and like, it's and science is a process rather than science is supposed to be a process rather than a kind of the goal.
Yeah, and that critical thinking being very important and is the basis of scientific research, is, as you said, being critical. And just to clarify, to wrap up that idea,
true science and God have any problem?
Oh, sorry, we just froze.
Science would. Oh, yeah, I don't think like true science and God have no problem. True science would go, well, actually, like, let's look for God, kind of thing. Whereas the science, TM, trademarked by Fauci and Gates and stuff, is anti-God. It's a cult. It's very dangerous as well. I've been saying this from the beginning, but it's very dangerous. I mean, you get, mass formation psychosis is the buzzword of the last few days. It's a nicer, more clinical way of saying you're in a cult. But cults, it wouldn't. So far, touch wood, we seem to have got through this fairly unscathed. One of the big reasons being that we haven't had a pandemic. We haven't. It's like there's, when Zhang Zongjin wrote his books on which my Uncharted Body is effectively based, it was the 1st century AD, and one of the plagues that ravaged his village, just one of them, killed 90% of his village. That's a pandemic.
And Ebola killed 9 out of 10 people who got it, and the bubonic plague killed 50% of Europe in 2 years. That's definitely full-on pandemic. So I just want to clarify before I move on to the other questions that I want to ask you, because I know that we're already getting long into it. I just want to clarify that a lot of people would call you an anti-vaxxer, and I just want you to be able to speak to that yourself, if you would call yourself that, or if you wouldn't, and if
not, I mean,
why.
define it. I always say to these terms, to please define them, and I'll tell you whether I fit into that definition.
Okay, well, they would say
define
that
anti-vaxxer,
because you didn't vaccinate your younger children, and you very clearly don't feel that this is a good vaccine to get, and you question the science to that degree, and you feel that it's cultish. People would say you would never get a vaccine. You don't trust any vaccines.
If that's what people want to define anti-vax, I know you're not saying that. I know you're devil's advocate, but it's a very weak definition of what. But yeah, I mean, technically, then in that case, because I didn't fully vaccinate all my children, and this vaccine I think is highly dangerous, then using that definition, some people, but that's not. I mean, this is my point about definitions. This is my point the whole way through my books. It's like, I don't even want to say I'm an anti-vaxxer, even though I've just said it. but
well, I think that when there's room for reasonable doubt, people like to be able to have the space for reasonable doubt and to make a determination for themselves within that.
My point is with all these things is they're just labels used to throw at people. It's like there's not actually, anti-vaxxer doesn't really mean anything. It's just a lazy label used. It's not much different to using like slur words like the N-word, or describing someone as, using cuss words against people. It's the same. It's in the same spectrum of dialogue. Oh, you're an anti-vaxxer. What you're saying is, I'm closing this conversation at this point because like your beliefs are ridiculous, absurd, and abhorrent. So I'm going to close the conversation by calling you an anti-vaxxer. So we're not going to have any intelligent conversation. That's what it's the same with conspiracy theorists. Oh, so I think Bill Gates has got like a huge financial incentive to keep this pandemic going. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. It's like, so in other words, you don't want to have a conversation about Bill Gates' financial interests in keeping the pandemic going. So you'll just call me a conspiracy theorist to close the conversation.
Right.
And that it's very important though. Like terminology is very important. It's one of the things I spend a lot of time with in the book. It's like chi. What is chi exactly? Chi is not energy, really. It's spirit. Chi, the best definition of chi is spirit. And then it changes things in terms of like your understanding, your relation relationship to this. And it's the same with the Jinglua system, or Jinglua Mai, which is where the
term meridian
translation of meridians came from, Georges Soulier de Meuron. Like, if you use the word meridians, like, then the doctors will naturally, or lay people will naturally say, but where are these meridians? Show me these meridians. Whereas the Jinglua Mai really translates beautifully, actually. I describe this in my book, but it's fascial connective, fascial rivers is Jing, fascial rivers, and Loi is connective tissue network. So those two things, fascial rivers, connective tissue web, go together to create this three-dimensional spider's web of space within the body through which chi flows. And the definitions are so important, and understanding what those definitions are is so important. And this goes through the whole of Chinese medicine. It's like, you know how like lung was capitalized. You know, I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I'm sure you have. When you're reading books on Chinese medicine, it's like the lung with a capital L. It's like, oh, is this a person called Lung? Or
right, all the meridians are like that. I kind of liken them to tarot cards in their depth instead of their surface version of us looking at it. But yeah, they're all capitalized. All capitalized,
yeah, because the reason, I don't know if you know this, but the reason they were capitalized was because early on, when this translation, this teaching was going on between Chinese medicine and the West, is people were saying, oh, the spleen governs transformation and transportation. The spleen keeps the blood in the vessels. Yeah. And so everyone was like, yikes, that doesn't appear to be what the spleen does. I mean, actually,
you explain it so well in your book, how these connections are. And that's why people who aren't even acupuncturists or working in the healthcare field would find your book interesting, because if they're interested in understanding Eastern to Western thought, you really do go into explaining in very layman's direct, easy terms why those connections are there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. It's all about keeping things simple and keeping those definitions like tight. So effectively, the spleen was capitalized because, like, they were saying, it's not the spleen, it's this Chinese spleen, which is kind of different in some way. Can't really explain how, but it's definitely different. But we're definitely right, and it's different, and it's kind of similar. Maybe it's not. Let's capitalize the spleen to make it clear it's not the Western spleen. So actually, what they were really doing was describing one half of one of these divisions that I'm talking about, of which the spleen was the strongest, dominant, energetic player. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's like the ultimate manifestation within this. It's like the big boss within the system, and so once you understand that, and you can get rid of that capitalization, say, no, that's the spleen, yeah, which actually does do a lot of that stuff anyway, but it also includes everything else within that division, which includes the pancreas, the entire endodermic lining of the gastrointestinal system below the diaphragm, and that's about it, really. But that basically covers all the all the functions of the spleen,
right?
And so you can get rid of that capitalization. But all of those definitions have to be very tight, and have to be very clear, so that we know what we're talking about. Because otherwise, you get in this mess. I mean, where basically we can be talking about two different things without realizing it.
Like talking about God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you know, God. Yeah, your definition of God and my definition would be different. Yeah, and that's fine.
Or
that's
just anybody's. Yeah, like it's such a perfect analogy for that. You know, anything. What the color blue? You know, the color blue would be different maybe to you, to me. We don't actually really know. In turning to fractals for a moment, so you had said to me when we spoke really briefly the first time when we connected, you said Spark in the Machine, because there's two books that you've written. I just want people to know about them. There's Spark in the Machine, which you said that you wrote first. And I just want to remember what you said, because it was a great explanation. You said, this one shows why Chinese medicine is not wrong. And then The Uncharted Body, which is a remarkable book. You said this proves why Chinese medicine is right. And I thought that was really great.
Yeah.
And this is an incredible book. I would, if you were an acupuncturist, I would definitely get this one. If you're just interested in the body, I would get Spark in the Machine, because this one is really, I mean, it's got beautiful, beautiful illustrations, beautiful descriptions of everything. I mean, it's a masterpiece of a book, I got to say, Dan.
No, thank you.
Really gorgeous. And I do want to actually, well, answer that question first. And then I have a question about this little diagram of this little guy here. We'll move into that. So do you want to just kind of give voice to, because you said that in the Uncharted Body, when you're really talking about why Chinese medicine is right, you said it's got, it said, if you want to know what's fractal about the body, that would explain it. So I just want you to have a chance to riff on the differences between the two books and what's fractal about the body.
I've got 5% left on my battery, so I should be all right. But
take your time to plug in if you want.
When I wrote The Spark in the Machine, it was the main thing was getting across this understanding that you have to have chi in order to explain how the body works. You kind of, and it actually kind of made a prediction that these electrical forces will be found to be primary in all actions within the body. The whole body is going to be running on effectively electrical forces, like a Tesla car or something. Tesla. I always use an analogy of a computer to explain how you can have something running perfectly happily with invisible forces. And if you took a computer to a Stone Age man that was running and he explained to him it's running on electricity, and he got a rock and started smashing open, go ooh, 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 looking for the electricity, and I don't believe you, there's not electricity in there.
Well, even, I'm sorry, I really want to just share a thought here, just if you can hold that for 1 second, because I do find it amazing that we use cell phones and all these different things, or even watching the television. I was watching a movie the other night, and I was thinking about how we think that I'm here and the TV's there, but we already know that light is going into the eye, reversing everything. There's a whole bunch happening between me and the TV, and yet we don't recognize that. Or the idea that this discussion about whether consciousness exists, or that we need to scientifically prove that something exists in order for it to exist. And I thought, well, we haven't even scientifically proven how we live or how our consciousness functions, and yet we're doing it. And so there's so many things that we do and that we use that we don't, like the computer and the Stone Age thing. There's a lot of things going on that we don't recognize.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And like cell phones, ESP, everyone's quite happy believing that I pick up my cell phone, I expect 100% guaranteed that's going to connect to you. 99.999% of the time it's going to work. Yeah, it somehow finds you. My cell phone. Yeah. But what's the difference between that and ESP? I don't see any real difference, apart from the fact that one's like a much more algorithmic based.
Well, that we haven't used our own temple spaces to know how to do it yet. We've got the technology inside, but we don't know how to use it. But we can trust somebody else's technology on the outside because that's easier. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I hope you can still remember what you were saying.
Yeah. So the Spark in the Machine was basically about showing that that this was the inevitability of having to have chi within a model of the body. It's just inevitable. You can't avoid it. You've got to have this. You've got to have chi. Otherwise, the body makes no sense. You can't explain the fundamental nature of the body, which is how it self-organizes. So you've got to have chi. And then the book was basically explaining how, look, if you were going to have an organizing force within the body, this is how it would move, and this is what science says about where it pulls and accumulates. And look, this is an exact match to the description of the acupuncture points and acupuncture channels within Chinese medicine. Ergo, they are the same. And then the kind of proof of that, in a way, was that you're going to always find electricity driving everything wherever you find it. Now, one of the points that someone made about this was, so the second and the third part of the book, which are actually separate books, really. What God Forgot to Tell Surgeons, the first book should have been published on its own in retrospect, and the other two were add-ons that I realized after I read the first one that you could keep moving. You could then explain other aspects, including why the 6 divisions were the descriptions of what the organs were. but they're kind of add-ons in a way. And those weren't really an explanation of how the body's working. Yeah, those were really just an explanation of, look, when the Chinese talk about the spleen keeping the blood within the vessels, what they're really saying is the spleen stores platelets. Well, they weren't really saying this. This is what happens. The spleen stores platelets. Platelets keep blood within the vessels. Yeah. So if the spleen is basically dominating, controlling, storing the platelets, in charge of the platelets, then the spleen is also in charge of keeping blood within the vessels, because it can release platelets when needed. And so on and so on. But what it didn't explain was a number of things that some smart people picked up on. Was it didn't explain what qi was doing within the mature organs. In other words, what was qi doing within the liver that caused the liver to actually run? What was this electricity doing within the liver itself? Yeah. Why, when I stick a needle into the foot, would it then affect this qi in the liver, etc., etc.? All these questions about the fundamentals of acupuncture practice. What the spark in the machine was really a proof of concept that this model of the body is way more sophisticated and intelligent than anyone's given it credit for, and actually provides a very good correlation with what we understand in the West. The uncharted body is like, actually, qi is the fundamental, most important force within the body. And basically, this is how it operates, and this is how it makes the organs work, and this is how acupuncture affects it. And it's all, even though that book is quite big by book standards, by textbook standards, it's tiny, like the uncharted body. I mean, if you just pick it up now and show its cross section, it's
a big heavy book.
Yeah, it's heavy, but it's not actually that, for a textbook of medicine, it's not that big. And that within that textbook is the entirety of like this Chinese philosophical tradition. You've got really sophisticated medicine in there, and so it's actually really simple to understand Chinese medicine. That's one of the key things. It's Western medicine. I say this as a Western doctor, like it's just this enormous mess of different ideas and hodgepodge of like empirical evidence, basically, that's now completely corrupted. That was going back to the beginning. That's the problem with it now. It's all empirical Western medicine. It's got no underlying philosophical idea about how the body works.
Can you just define empirical for people who might not be familiar?
Empirical means that you do something, see what the result is, and then use that to guide further knowledge by accumulation of. So empirical means that we gave this, as far as I know anyway, we gave this drug, and 9 times out of 10 the person got better, so we'll give that drug again. So it's not that there was a philosophy or a theory or anything as to let's give this drug because of the theory. It's just we found in the past that this has worked. Hey, that's fine.
Whether we understand how it worked or not, the point is that it worked.
Yeah. And that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that whatsoever. But you've got to understand that is how Western medicine just works on this basis of it worked in the past, so we'll carry on doing it. And this can drag it down as well. So like there's loads of stuff in Western medicine that doesn't work, they use. Trauma collars. Ever see someone in trauma, one of those neck braces on? They're absolute quackery. They don't work. The only people who should have one of those on are people who request one of those on. That's it. That was the question I used to anyone coming in with one of these things on, because they put them on like a reflex. They're trained to put them on practically before they do anything else here. And we can go into why this was. It's a very interesting story. But I just asked that everyone who came in, the first question I say is, do you want that collar on? The only people who ever answered yes were people who had broken their necks. Everyone else went, no, take it off me. And I'd be like, okay, great. I'd ask a few more questions as well.
Right.
Because otherwise the paramedics around me would probably start screaming blue murder. But that entire thing about cervical collars was an idea that they would do good. They do more unless you actually want one, you have broken neck. But so that's kind of an example of empirical gone wrong. So Western medicine doesn't have an underlying philosophy of health. It doesn't have something as sophisticated. It doesn't even have the idea that you've got energy running around you, apart from an ECG and an EEG. It doesn't have an organizational idea about how the body functions. You know, the 6 divisions, what the 6 divisions does is links physiology to embryology to anatomy. So in other words, the 6 division says, look, this plane exists for this function in the greater world, actually. You know, basically the tie-in plane, which is the intestinal tract, it exists as a function of bringing in dampness or controlling dampness, bringing in goodness, but controlling this dampness, which is like this osmotic toxin effect. That's what dampness is. And that's what it does. So everything within that plane is very concerned with excreting toxins, dealing with toxins within the body, which is why, but these are like osmotic toxins rather than the things that, like things like sugar, for instance, and carbon dioxide, you know, and sugar is from your pancreas, and carbon dioxide is from the lungs, and the pancreas and lungs both in this. So then, like this 6 divisions that links the physiology with the anatomy and with the embryology, the whole thing gets interwoven, which is how it should be.
Right.
Because the body hasn't gone, oh, let's develop physiologically along these lines and anatomically along these lines and embryologically along these lines. It's done all 3 at the same time, function following form.
Yeah, very good.
And that's the big difference. And so that's why, like, that book is only that fat.
Right.
Yeah. Because that's contained within that book is embryology, anatomy, physiology, plus chi science, effectively, all within, you know, that's like 4 different specialities in Western medicine, of which, you know, I remember, you know, they're like that, each one's about that size. Right. Yeah. And so, incomprehensible garbage, most of it. I'm serious.
Right. No, yeah. I mean, it's great to have your opinion as a Western MD and an acupuncturist. So going back to the idea, you were mentioning the Russian dolls and fitting into each other, and this fractal idea of, I mean, what is fractal about the body, in your opinion?
Oh, I think the whole universe is effectively fractal in nature, and it's got itself. It's self-repeating blocks. I mean, if you look at an atom in the solar system, they're kind of similar. Yeah, I think everything's just fractal. So, I mean, even society is fractal. For sure. So, but in relation to TCM specifically, you had mentioned to me in that first conversation that the uncharted body kind of describes like what is fractal about the body. And I just wonder if you could give a couple of examples for people. So to understand, so one of the big questions, like I said, was like, how does this electricity, this chi, work within the organs? And this was a big problem for me. Because in the heart, it's fairly easy to show you've got electricity running the heart. But say, for instance, the kidney or the liver or the spleen is particularly tricky. So what occurred to me was that actually all of these organs, and especially liver, spleen, lung, are actually built up of tiny fractal versions of their bigger organ. Yeah. So a baby lung, a fractal lung, is called an alveoli. It kind of effectively looks like a lung. It's got like, you know, it just looks like a baby little lung, you know. And then you've got the nephron in the kidney, which looks like a baby kidney and collecting system, which is what it is. It's a fractal one. And then within the liver, you've got liver sinusoid, which is like a baby liver, fractal liver. So now, once you get down to this level, when you start to look at the these fractal what are they called again? I call them functional units, the smallest part of the organ that can still operate on its own independently. Yeah, functional unit. These are microns in size. These are tiny. These are composed of individual cells, but they all have effectively a membrane across which sits an electrical charge, and that electrical charge governs what moves across the membrane. So in the case of the heart, which also has like effectively a functional unit, which is like a branching heart cell, the membrane is the membrane of the heart cell itself, and the chi moves across the membrane. When it does this, it's called depolarization. It drives calcium into the cell, and that causes the cell to contract.
Yeah.
So what chi is doing in this case is driving calcium across the cell membrane. Now in the liver, it drives like good stuff that you've absorbed from your food, and in your kidney, it drives water-soluble toxins into the bladder. So, but they've all got these functional membranes, these membranes with an electrical charge on one side, and that drives something across the membrane. It drives the process of the organ. Now, the question obviously is, well, is the electrical charge accidentally there or incidentally there, or does it have, if you got rid of the electrical charge, would like the organ still work perfectly well? And this is a difficult question to categorically answer because very little research into it. We know in the heart, definitely, if you start messing around with that electrical current across the heart membrane, that's going to really cause big problems. Your heart's not going to be happy about that, and you're going to get arrhythmias. So that one, definitely. But also in the kidneys, they've done experiments where they put tiny electrodes into giant nephrons, which are found in some kind of sea creatures. And they found that when they mess this electrical charge up across the Bowman's capsule, the kidney stopped working. So there's plenty of evidence now to show that electricity is driving these internal organs. And that's when chi and acupuncture come in. And what we're doing with acupuncture is effectively, we're just trying to regulate that that charge within the organs.
So are you saying that what's fractal, or the fact that there are these membranes where something's passing over, whether it's an electrical charge or whether it's some sort of osmotic kind of function, or?
The fractal nature of it is the fact that each kidney contains 500,000 nephrons, and each nephron is effectively a tiny kidney.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying. So that you've got the smaller to the larger, and it's repeating itself to actually create the organ itself. And yet the vision of it and the function of it is the same. Okay.
Yeah. And then really basically if you fractal that up to the next dimension, I put in the sparkling machine, if you were an alien the size of a planet and you came down to Earth, and you probably wouldn't notice the individual humans, which are like cells, but you'd see all the things we've built. And the fractal kidney at that level would be your sanitation plants, which separate the water from the effluent.
Right.
It would probably maybe a huge mega being might mistake the sanitation plants for an organ, and the humans running around
same
it as
process,
cells.
Different scale kind of idea.
You got it. You got it. And then the government becomes brain, and the army becomes the liver, and and then you've got all your network of supermarkets, which is like the stomach. So it's the same process.
Right, very much so. You described that really well in your book too. So there's a couple of things that I just want to, I know that we're going to kind of wrap things up, and I know you're getting low on some computer juice at the moment. But so the two things that I would like to cover is one, this diagram in the book in relation to what you're describing here and what I see in the body. Before we do that, I want you to give people some.
Just move over here. You'll get a nice view of my my kitchen.
No problem. So I also wanted to have people have a really good understanding. You write we've talked about a lot of things that are very intellectual, left brain. And yet you also write some really beautiful things in your book about, for instance, the heart. I was talking about this while I was teaching stretch class the other day, this, and the pericardium, and how the pericardium, which looks like this really, and I've done cadaver work where it looks like this, as you were saying, this very unappealing sac around the heart that really doesn't do anything. And yet you describe the really beauty of even this liquid crystalline kind of formation that collagen in the bone forms, and that goes on. And all of a sudden I really understood the pericardium is holding this powerful electrical force in the middle of my chest, so that my entire chest doesn't get damaged by the huge amount of electrical activity happening. And that the pericardium is also kind of the membrane that allows only a certain amount out, and is also the barrier to what it electromagnetically is going to allow into the heart in order to keep the heart safe.
Yeah,
and
that's
you
what I
discuss it
suspect.
as like
Yeah.
a liquid crystalline function, and it was beautiful and really profoundly affected me. And so I wondered if you could just share what that means to people.
Yes, I mean the heart is the emperor within, it's considered the emperor. So in other words, it's like the king in chess. So the everything should, in terms of treatment as well, everything should move around the king. In a perfect chess game, the king never actually moves. Everything moves around it. And so the heart is similar in that it's got this very difficult job. It's got to constantly beat. It's got to constantly pump blood and energy around the body, and it can never stop. And it's extremely thirsty for energy. It's the most energy thirsty organ within our body, apart from the kidneys. Interestingly enough, the heart and the kidney are exactly the same in their energy demands per gram of tissue, which makes perfect sense. Because,
and they're
of course,
coupled in the 6 divisions. Yeah,
they're in the same division. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And then so the pericardium, so the heart, one of the heart's problems is that it has to be protected, and it has to be protected at a physical level and an emotional level as well. And the pericardium, I believe, in this very thick collagenous net that surrounds the heart, it's because collagen is piezoelectric. I believe that the pericardium is also able to shield the heart from electromagnetic frequencies and electromagnetic frequencies that are occurring at a human level, and it's like a Faraday cage, I suppose, for the heart. It would kind of look like a Faraday cage with all these cross-linked collagen fibers, and constantly, every time the heart beats, it's going to be producing this electrical surge as well, and also keeping it within. So it's the heart protector is a good name for the pericardium, or the ambassador.
And what's the
to
crystalline factor that you were referring to? I know
So
that in the bones, there's this piezoelectrical force as well. And you were talking about that, the relationship between collagen and anyway, sorry, go ahead.
So the so the piezo. So collagen itself is a very interesting substance, and it's piezoelectric, so it generates electricity. And this is one of the reasons why all of your fascia is made out of collagen. Everything that wraps your internal body up. People love putting collagen in their face because it's in the face anyway. It's everywhere. Collagen. It's 30% of all your body protein is collagen, and it creates electricity as it moves. Which is phenomenal when you think about it, because this is completely, you tell this to any doctor and they'll probably go, what, really? I don't believe that. Or, but it does. It definitely, no doubt about it, produces it. And so every time you move, you're creating this electrical force. And this is one reason why when you've been sitting at a cold desk for a long time, you get up and you feel stiff and you feel a cold that kind of gets into the bones. Because actually what's happened is this fascial system that also connects into the bones as well, because the bones should be understood really as crystallized fascia. That's what they are. They're fascia that's been cross-linked in such a way that they are unable to be easily bent. Then when you haven't been moving much, this fascial system also becomes a bit slow and sluggish and isn't generating electricity as much, which is why it's called the triple burner. And that's why you can get that kind of deep cold. I know I get it because I have an attic room and the heater's not very good, and I'm sitting there for a couple of hours doing work, and I suddenly get up and realize that I've got this really kind of deep cold. I can kind of feel it in my body. I move around a bit and it goes. So collagen, that piezoelectricity ability of collagen is really important, and it's always producing warmth and heat in our body, which is so fascia has a kind of, if you want to know what the triple burner is, it's fascia. Basically, if you want to know what fascia is, it's basically collagen, but it's more than that. Everything's kind of more than what we define in terms, but it's still good to have these kind of definitions that are quite clear, so that we can kind of start agreeing on what's going on to a certain level.
And then in relation to the heart, when you were talking about the kind of liquid crystalline structure of this powerhouse in the middle of the chest, I can't remember quite what you said. I could probably find it and quote it if you want me to.
Yeah, no, it basically, like I said, it's a lot of conjecture that I'm pretty sure I'm right, but I don't have any studies to back this up.
Right.
Like, apart from the fact that collagen is piezoelectric, I have plenty of studies to back that up. Yeah. We know that the pericardium is very thick fascia, and fascia is made out of collagen. Right. We know it's piezoelectric, and so by first principles, we can say that every time the heart beats, the pericardium is generating, modulating, is affecting the electromagnetic force within the heart. And then it's like over to Chinese medicine effectively to teach us. There's a certain point with the theory when you just kind of go, okay, over to you guys, because you seem to really know what you're talking about. Right. And and you've said the same thing for 2,000 years, and there's been, nobody has seriously ever, proven you wrong, I suppose. But the problem is nobody ever really proved them right, which was Western science's whole thing, wasn't it? It's like there's, the whole problem with acupuncture, the whole reason why it's misunderstood is because of mistranslations over and over and over again. Mistranslations, like just phenomenal basics mistranslations that would have stymied even the best researchers. The Jingluo Mai being the most obvious one into meridians. It's channels or connective tissue network. Yeah. And even
you put a lot of those in your book too, of where you're describing different, you obviously have a lot of knowledge around being able to translate the characters more efficiently than how we use them, like what you've just described.
I mean, even the Renmai. So the Renmai got translated as conception vessel. Yeah. I translate it as yolk channel. The conception vessel, like I saw something from Maciocia, who's, do you know Maciocia? Maciocia, who sadly has passed away now, but he actually put up a kind of menswear when you admit guilt. He said,
"Oh, mansplaining."
No, not mansplaining. He, as a man, he's obviously mansplains his entire life. But
sorry, I don't know where.
I think it's menswear, where you say, "Whoops, did that, my fault."
Oh, my bad.
Men's culpa or something, and he basically put up this menswear saying, conception vessel, whoops, mistranslation. Actually, this character, Ren, it was a slightly different character that we translated into conception. It doesn't mean conception. It actually means balancing across. It's like balancing across two extremes or something. I forget exactly what, but basically it's the yolk sac.
Right. And I would basically say that's also the plane of energy going from Ren to Du through the body, creating a balance and a sagittal plane through the body. That's what I hear. And it's
also like when the embryo grows, there's this yolk sac that nourishes the developing baby, and it would make sense in this other character, Ren, that the proper one, not the one that got mistakenly translated, and also in Wang Juyi's book, he says, it's akin to the yolk sac in the embryo. Right. So it's like it's the yolk vessel. So that's what I mean. It's like, the Ren Mai doesn't mean anything, does it? Conception vessel doesn't mean anything. Does it? Realistically, it doesn't. And it's a mistranslation for number one. Number two, even if it wasn't a mistranslation, what the hell does it mean? Conception vessel. Right. Yeah. So that's what I mean about defining terms like yolk sac. If you know what the yolk sac is, I mean, if you've had an egg, you know what a yolk sac is, don't you? So, it's that yellow thing that basically it nourishes the chick, and that's exactly what this is. Right. And basically the way I describe using this channel to my students is like I use the points on it where I kind of want to distribute a bit more nutrition into a particular organ. So if, for instance, if Ren 6, Qi high, and Ren 4, Guan Yang,
I'm like, okay, like I'm going to use that to kind of effectively tell the body, put some more chi into the lower jiao, or let's, nourish the sperm and eggs, which is what Ren 4 does, the
Right,
original
exactly.
gates of the yin and yang.
Yes.
So then it brings it to life, then it makes it real. Then, conception vessel is kind of meaningless, but
Yeah.
yolk vessel is
Yeah.
like meaningful.
And that's
so
how we
that,
learn it in acupuncture school too. I mean, it's just so kind of, and the fact that we can even put Chinese medicine in chapters, in these little lines and boxes, where it was all very circular in the first place. I think, we're really at an exciting time where we're learning how to think in lines and circles at the same time, as opposed to just one particular path. But I don't want to take up a lot more of your time. And I really appreciate all the time that you're spending. I do want to ask just one more question. In the uncharted body, and I'll show a better picture of this, but this little guy there with the diagram of the lines through him. Now, what I find interesting about this, I'd like you to know, you're talking about the jellyfish just having the 3 layers there. These 3 lines in the limbs and 3 lines in the legs. And the way that what I see in the body is that the meridians braid into 3 primary lines through the middle of the body, which is really more spiral in nature. And that you've got 3 lines on the arms, 3 lines on the legs, and that all of the meridians, and again, these planes ideas running through this. So you've got 6 instead of 3, if you look at them as planes, but if you just look at them on the skin, there's 6. And that they all weave like a braid into the middle part of the body. So when I look at this diagram, that's what I see in relation to what I'm seeing in the body in relation to what you're describing. So I'm wondering if you can just describe what this little image is a little bit more.
Yeah, that I mean that image is kind of it was just supposed to illustrate the idea of lines of connection through the body very simply. Because in that first chapter of the Uncharted Body, I basically effectively go through what God forgot to tell surgeons, because I can't rewrite the whole what God forgot to tell surgeons, because that's pointless. But effectively it's trying to get through that within about 3 to raise people's understanding. And so that picture, all it was supposed to demonstrate was just a very simplistic concept of how like the body was connected through lines, through channels. So there wasn't anything deeper going on in that, actually. I should have probably made it clearer.
It's just interesting because it also is kind of a very similar picture of if I had to just draw a stick figure idea of what I'm seeing, even though there's a lot more complexity behind it. That's what I would have drawn.
And that's what it's supposed to be. Yeah, it's supposed to be a very kind of
well, it's interesting that they match. It's interesting that they're the same. What your map is and my map actually look the same in that picture. And so just to kind of sum up the end of that, I know that you saw a talk that I gave. And again, this is a simplistic overview of a lot of ideas, but in relation to the organizational layers in the body, there are these particular areas of what I call intersection points in the body, actually, and I call them nodes as well, organizational nodes. That is where the tension primarily holds and pulls in the interior of the body. There's a lot I have to say about that, and there's a lot that I've even seen with how metastasis works and cancer and different things. And I'm just wondering if there is any relationship at all to what you see embryologically in relation to this form.
Well, they seem a bit like chakras, which I do have
there's
time
a chakra system up the center, and I actually feel that a chakra is actually found in every cell. So it depends on what fractal level you're going to look at. So yes, you could call them fractal.
The chakras, I think, correspond perfectly to the so you have this group of cells called neural crest cells that create your brain, create all your autonomic nervous system, create entire mini brains called ganglions, which are effectively a mini brain. So there's a ganglion that connects to your heart, ganglion that connects to your vital tissues around here. There's the solar plexus, there's a ganglion, and then there's a ganglion down in your nether regions as well. And like these effectively correspond perfectly to chakras. So I think that's what they are. And then in terms of the rest of the lines of force within the torso, yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on those lines of forces at all, because they're kind of, there is a whole thing about abdominal palpation, abdominal diagnosis.
Yeah.
where people kind of actually do something similar to that, and they feel parts of the abdomen, diagnose from there. But I don't do that much. I do more channel palpation, which is feeling along the channels and the extremities. So,
Right.
I mean, there must be something to it.
Yeah, I just wondered because when you were talking about organizational centers and the neural crest cells and the way that the embryo starts to like have these little hubs and areas where it kind of communicates information of how things are supposed to run to the rest of the body. It just very much struck me that there's a similarity. And this shape is very fractal in nature too. It's, it exists on the very small and the very large. It's kind of frozen in the middle of the body to make a point that when I'm working on a body and somebody's bringing, a neck or a shoulder pain to me, I'm actually focused on deep in the center here, and also related down into the abdomen and different areas of how this inner relationship of tensegrity basically plays off of each other. And that there are particular hubs within the tensegrity that allow for easiest access to be able to adjust the system. And so as soon as we stop thinking about the neck or the shoulder or the arm, and we can actually think to core and go in, the nervous system jumps and releases in a whole different way. And it really makes whatever therapy, however hands-on therapy somebody is working, much more effective. Or when I'm teaching people how to stretch and release tension in their own body, to stop thinking about their neck pain or their shoulder pain, again, for a simple version, and actually think inside and open. And the brain makes some sort of connection between the subconscious and conscious mind, and deeper release happens. Allowing more blood flow and what have you. So I just wondered if maybe there was some great, you were like, yes, neurologically, that's exactly, who knows, right? So I just thought I would throw that out there. So thank you very much for your time. I know it's been longer than we expected. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm very pleased to meet you. And
likewise. It's been a pleasure.
And I will let people know too. I'm recommending Spark in the Machine as recommended reading for my Meridian program that is coming out in February of 2022, in less than a month now. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you want to buy Dan's books, either one of them, Spark in the Machine or The Uncharted Body, he's offering 10% off with the code Meredith. Always a hard name to spell, but MEREDITH. And I will include in the links a link to his website and all of his programs and the wonderful work that he's doing. So thank you very much. I know that when you worked with the Chinese practitioner, Wang, whatever his name was. Yeah, I remember reading in the book that you were saying, do you realize this is so connected to embryological formation? And he said, no, but clearly you're the one who should write the book. So thank you for writing it.
You have to go and write a book about it, he said.
Yeah, I was like, oh, man. I thought that was great.
Oh, man, why did I ask that question?
Sorry?
I remember thinking, why did I ask that question?
Perfect.
Oh,
right?
I'm glad I did. He said, no, but you must go and write a book about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing it. It's been a fascinating read for me, and there's a lot of information there. So
Great.
If there are any other questions for Dr. Dan, you can contact him on, what is your website?
www.drdankeown.com.
Keown.
WN,
yeah, beautiful. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Meredith.
New Year's to you.
And speak soon.
Okay, take care. Thank you.